Alrighty, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Everyday Theology with Joey Anderson. It has been a while, hasn't it? If you are listening, I want to thank you for tuning in, even though it's been a couple months. I apologize for that. Just I think life and other things going on that have kept me from recording. But I want to get back into it in the start of the new year now, looking at 2026. Last year, I made some promises of doing an episode every week, which I think was ambitious. And while I just about reached that, I don't necessarily want to put um, a goal on what this year will look like. I will continue to release episodes as they come. So make sure that you're sending those questions. If you are enjoying this podcast, then you sending episodes or sending questions in will help this podcast continue. And so I encourage you to continue to send questions. And so we'll answer questions as they come. If we don't get any, then we'll let it sit for a while. And we'll just wait on other questions or things that will pop up to come up, and we'll go from there. So I thank you for tuning in. I actually do have a couple questions that were sent in just recently this past week as well. I wanted to just kind of update people on where I'm at with speaking and so on and so forth. So if you didn't know, you didn't see it on the social media page, was able to speak at Grace Adventures Ministry here in Mears, Michigan, and that was this last weekend. They had about 230 students and a handful of volunteers, and so I think all in all, we were probably around 300 by the end of that in total for the weekend, just between students and volunteers and the band and everyone who worked with Grace Adventures to help put that on. And so super enthusiastic about that weekend. It was a great weekend, a fantastic weekend. Got to meet a lot of students, maybe some of them who are listening now. So I'm really excited to share. They did tell me they were going to record the lessons, and so I'm hoping that I might be able to put those up onto the podcast here, maybe sometime in February, if not March. So you guys can look forward to those, and I can get feedback from you guys on that as well. And so that was an awesome opportunity. I'm hoping to go back next year and do that again, as well as maybe trying to get my foot in the door on some other camps. So if you guys have any camps around you, or know any places that might be looking for speakers, maybe a camp that you grew up in, and you can just send them my email, or even just shoot me an email of what camp that is, and I'd love to get in contact with them and try to begin to do more of that as well. So I thank you for all of those. We're going to get into today's episode. It might be kind of a shorter one, but I guess it's a good introductory back into the swing of things. So today's episode is we're dealing with a question in the book of Genesis. It's from Connor, and Connor asked, what is the reason that God accepted Abel's offering versus Cain's offering? And so as we look at this, we see it right in the book of Genesis. So it's in the book of Genesis, chapter 4, and it is immediately after it's the next. In Genesis chapter 3, we read of the fall of creation. It's when Adam and Eve sin, and God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden. And the book of Genesis, chapter 4, starts with Adam and Eve procreating, and they give birth to two. First, Eve gives birth to Cain. And then she later on, after Cain, gives birth to Abel. And so Cain and Abel are brothers, and Abel is the shepherd of the flocks, while Cain works the ground. And so we see Cain and Abel are the first offspring of Adam and Eve. And it is what is not lost on me is the fact that we're like literally we're not generations after Cain or Adam and Eve did mankind fall into depravity and fall into sin, but the first generation of human beings after Adam and Eve fall into sin. And so we see the effects of the fall, not pages and chapters and books later in the Bible, but literally the next chapter begins this, or really is the continuation of the effects of the fall. And so we see that through Adam and Eve, we see that sin is transferred to we see that sin is transferred through the blood into the offspring of Adam and Eve, and this is, I think, telling because it reminds us that we inherit the sin. I would say not necessarily like the sin of our fathers and forefathers, but we inherit the capacity to sin, and we are all affected by that fall. And it doesn't skip generations, and it's not, so on and so forth. And so I think that's a telltale sign that we're really going to experience throughout all of Scripture the effects of sin and the effects of the fall, which again highlights, I think, as well, our need for Jesus. And so we see in the very first chapter after the fall of Adam and Eve, fall of the garden, the fall of creation, we see our need for Jesus. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of why, right? We're talking about sacrifice before even any of the rules and any of the design of sacrifice was really laid out in the Scriptures. And so it's an important question to ask. Okay, so we have two sacrifices right in chapter 4, and it says that God was accepting of one, approved of one sacrifice, and disapproved of another. And so we read in chapter 4, we'll just pick up in verse 3. So chapter 4, starting in verse 3, in the course of time, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. And Cain was furious, and he looked despondent. And so we see and we have two brothers offering two separate offerings, each for their own sake, and each of a different origin, I would say, right? Like Cain is offering up some produce from the land because that's what he does. He tends the land, and so he's offering up from what he tended, what he worked on, to the Lord. And then we also see that Abel offers to the Lord as well. And Abel is the younger brother, and Abel is the shepherd of tending his father's sheep, tending his father's flock. And we see that Abel offers up the meat portions and the fat offerings and the fat portions of his animals. And we see that the Lord responds to Cain and Abel's offerings in much a different light. And so while it's interesting, I mean, we don't know, and chapter 4 doesn't specifically tell us, hey, this is how you ought to sacrifice. This is what sacrifice looks like. And so we could read a chapter like this and go, why did God accept not accept Cain's offering, but accept Abel's? And so we look at, I think it's safe, and I think that it's the right thing to do, to look at how did God perceive offerings in Scripture? What was the point of offerings? What was God talking about when he demanded offerings? And even, I mean, we read in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy that God lays out this structure for what offering is meant to be for and what it looks like. And so while it exists post Genesis chapter 4, I think it gives proper context to why God might disapprove of one offering while approving of another. And so um, what we read later on in the scriptures is that God designed sacrifice to be a um, a loss of life in place of, or the loss of something in place of, um, oneself. And so often, like, there was a punishment for the actions that the Israelites did, like the sin that they committed. And so God presented a couple different ways for that sin to be covered or to be represented, in order that the people might not be killed in their sin, might not lose their life in their sin. And so God creates, and he does this in his covenant with Abraham. He he splits the animals in half. And so we see it in the order of the Levites, in the priesthood of the Levites, that God creates a system where, like, so for instance, one example of what a sacrifice might look like is bringing in an animal without blemish, so without fault, without sore, there would be no spots, no blemish, it wouldn't be weak. And often it was, not only was it, something that was without spot or without blemish, an animal like such as a sheep, a goat, doves were often used. So not only was it a spotless lamb or a spotless sheep or a spotless goat, but it was, often too, like in some specific circumstances, it was the firstborn of those animals. It was the firstborn of, so it's the firstborn of those animals, and it was specifically for these purposes, because God was saying, you need to give me your best, the best of what you have, in sacrifice, in propitiation for the sins that you've committed and that you've wronged me with. And so we see a key, I think, example and a key component of what sacrifice looks like is what we see later on in the chapters, and even honestly, in Genesis chapter 4. So what we read is that Cain offers some of his produce. Those are the words that we read in Genesis chapter 4. He offers some of his produce. And but what we read of Abel is that Abel offers the firstborn and the fat portions. And so the Bible makes a distinction here, that it's stating that Cain did not offer the best of the land, the first fruits of his labor. He offered some. And we can assume that this could be that Cain, took stock of what he had, looked at what he had, and decided to set some, after he had portioned out what he wanted, what he needed, the best of what he had for himself and for his family. He then gave the Lord what was left. But what we read is that Abel's offering is different, and not just in the fact that it's not, fruits and vegetables from the land, but that it's, different in the fact that it's the animals. But what we read is that Abel offers the best of his animals. He offers not only the firstborn, which is a step in faith, really, but he also offers the fat portions, which was considered during this time and during the Old Testament time a delicacy. I mean, the fat portions were the best part of the animal, and they were used in a lot of different ways in the cooking process and in other processes. That the fat portions were things that were it would have been a sacrifice, no pun intended there, for Abel to present not only his firstborn, the firstborn of the flock and the firstborn of the animals, but also the fat portions, which is the highest quality of the highest quality of the sacrifice of the animal. And so what we see is that, right, like, Abel is offering not only a different type of sacrifice, but a different quality of sacrifice. And I think it speaks to the heart. And so, and we read later on, I mean, what we see of the character and the nature of God is that God perceives the heart. God knows the heart. And in fact, you see this very clearly in the Gospels, in Jesus's interactions with the people and with the Pharisees and the people of the time, is that Jesus perceives the heart behind the questions that the Pharisees ask and the disciples ask. He perceives the heart of the actions of the people that he's walking alongside. He knows their heart. And he knows, so it's not just about this idea, this concept of giving to God, but giving our best to him. And we see this very clearly in the sacrifices of Cain and Abel. Cain, might have grown up understanding uh, the failings of his father and mother, Adam and Eve, and might have grown up with concerns and warnings. Hey, like the Lord sees you, the Lord knows, and this is how we honor and we glorify Him is through sacrifice. And so he might know the structure that sacrifice is meaning to take. But it's evident in his sacrifice in Genesis chapter 4 that it was not done with a gracious and trusting heart. And we see we see the heart of Cain even just a couple of verses later, right? We know the story of Cain and Abel, and maybe you don't, but in the story of Cain and Abel, so Cain, gives his offering, and Abel gives his, and God appreciates Abel's and is gloried and honored in Abel's, and does not look upon Cain's offering with joy. And Cain is jealous and angry and bitter towards that. And so he tricks his brother Abel out to coming to the field with them, away from the prying eyes of their family and anyone who might see, and he kills his brother Abel out of jealousy and rage and anger. And so we see that the heart of Cain was not in a place which sought to glory God in his sacrifices, but rather to um, appease his God so that he might continue to live the way in which he wanted. And what we see from Abel's offering is that Abel is giving to the Lord a gift to the Lord, and not just the portion of his hard work and a portion of what he had, but the best of his portions. And it speaks to the heart of Abel, that Abel desired to not only give to the Lord, but to give the best of what he had. And so I think when you begin to see it in this way and begin to read it and understand the purpose of sacrifice, that it was meant to, cover and cover the sins of one's actions. It was meant to glorify and honor God. I remember first reading this question and then going back and coming under the assumption that, like, the first thought that came to my mind when I read this passage, the reason that God had um, favor on Abel's offering and not on Cain's was because Abel's was meat, was life that was sacrificed for the sake of for God. Like Abel sacrificed the animals and the lifeblood that was in the animals, and that's what we see a lot in Old Testament sacrifice, is that it was often, I mean, if not always, a offering of life, and the animals were in the stead of human life, and because the Lord didn't desire for human sacrifice, um, and uh, and so I was like, oh yeah, that's the reason. But the more I began to read and to question and to think about it, the more I realized that the reason that the Lord had joy in Abel's offering and not in Cain's was hangs on, I think, those couple words there where it says that the Cain gave the Lord some of his produce, and Abel gave the Lord the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. And when you read and when you understand what it means the significance of the firstborn and the significance of the fat portions in that society, in that time, and in that age, it becomes clear that, and I find that it's consistent with the character and the nature of God, is that God saw the heart of Abel and God saw the heart of Cain, and he saw it, and so when they both acted out their hearts, and Cain gave the Lord some of what he had, um, and we can draw conclusions that whatever he gave of the Lord was not the best that he had, wasn't the greatest of what he was able to gather from his fields, but was rather just a portion of it. It could have been maybe a less desirable portion, a portion that was unable to be eaten, or just a portion that had bruises, and so on and so forth. And then we read of Abel's offering, and we see that Abel took the time and the care, and showed a heart that desired to give the Lord the best of what he had. Then we see that Abel's offering was accepted based on those grounds, and not on the grounds um, of necessarily what it was made up of. And I mean that in the sense of, like, the meat versus the fruit and veggies. And I think that it all this is to say, right? So we look at this, and we come to the conclusion that that's the reason that God accepted Abel's offering, was because it was the best of what Abel was able to give. And then he rejects Cain's offering because um, it was not his best that he could give. And we say, okay, Lord, like, that's the crux of Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 5. And we say, okay, that's the crux. And so then we have to come to terms with, okay, what is the overarching eternal message here that's meant for me as a believer, as somebody who's reading this passage, that the Lord knows. And I believe it's quite simple. I believe that the truth of the message in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 5, is that the Lord sees our hearts, um, and the Lord knows the heart behind our giving. The Lord knows the heart behind, and we're talking specifically about sacrifices in Genesis chapter 4. But uh, in Romans chapter 12, uh, Paul says in verses 1 and 2, he says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, pleasing, and acceptable unto God. And so we say, okay, if we're to read these passages in tandem, if we're to say, okay, we're meant to give the Lord our best, and then when it comes to sacrifices, and then in Romans, in light of the life and the death of Jesus, and we read that in Romans we're meant to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, which is to say, okay, we present all of our actions, all of our deeds, all of our words, all of ourselves as a sacrifice unto the Lord. Then we need to put two and two together and say, okay, then when we present our bodies, it needs to be the best of our bodies, not what's left over, not what is left over at the end of the day after we're tired and we've done all the things that we want to do and we've gone to work. But we need to we need to say, okay, Lord, what is, or just look inwardly and say, what is the best that I have to give? What's the best time that I have to offer to the Lord? When am I most engaged with Him? When am I most, willing to read and to seek Him? And I need to give Him that time. Even if it's at the beginning of my day, if it's in the middle of my day during lunchtime, if it's while I'm at work, if it's when I come home from work, if it's at the dinner table, if it's at the bedside, I'm not going to sit here and tell you there's a best time for you specifically, but it's clear and it's evident that regardless of when that time is, even if it's distinct to you, you are meant to give it to the Lord, not some of your fruits of your labor, but the best of it, not the stuff that demands little of you, in terms of, I've already sorted through my time, I've already sorted through my money, I've already sorted through my desires and my wants, and I've kept the things that I want to keep close to me, and Lord, here's the rest of it. But rather to take all of it to the Lord, or to take the best of yourself to the Lord and say, Lord, I give you this, because it's the best I can give you. And that's going to be it's going to be different for everybody. It's going to look a little bit different for everybody. Your best is going to look different than my best, and it might be better in some areas, and it might be worse in some areas, um, right? But the key context here, the key problem, and the key takeaway is that it matters more that you're giving the best of yourself, and that's what matters the most. And it's not a comparison game. It's not to say, hey, my best is better than your best, and your best is better than my best, and our best is better than the next person's best, and our church is better than this church, and so on and so forth. Um, it's not a comparison game. It's to look and to see and to give the Lord the best of yourself. And I think that is our key takeaway from our passage this morning, or this afternoon, this morning. Sorry, I guess I'm in preacher mode. But it's to take the best of ourselves, to give our best to the Lord daily. And this is what is holy and acceptable unto the Lord. Like I said, in Romans chapter 12, when Paul writes to the church in Rome, right, he says, um, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, I urge you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. And so we do so, right, and we will some days and sometimes we're going to present our bodies as a living sacrifice in the effects and the efforts of what Cain did. And I'm not going to sugarcoat that. We're not going to hide from that fact. Sometimes we mess up a lot. But Paul says the goal is to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, to to be holy and to please him. And how do we know that we are being holy and pleasing, or how is it being holy and pleasing to God? We read that in Abel's offering, the first fruits, right? The firstborn, and the fat portions. It's the best of the animals, the best of ourselves. That is what is holy and pleasing to God. And he says that this is an act of our spiritual worship. And we do this by not being conformed to this age, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds, so that we can discern what is good, pleasing, and what is the perfect will of God. And so my encouragement to you is to take the lessons from Genesis chapter 4, and the idea of Cain's offering versus Abel's offering, to take that understanding and to say, Lord, I want to give you what is the best of me. God, I want to give you not just the afterthought of me, not just what I have left over when all is said and done, but I want to give you the best of me every single day. Lord, help to grow me in that capacity. Help to train me in the ways that I ought to go. Help to teach me discernment so that I might know the ways that I can please you and glorify you and love you. God, take what you require me, and give me what is needed in order that I might do that. Um, that's the process of being sanctified, right? Is seeking to be more of that and to do that more. And so that's my encouragement to everyone today from this podcast episode. So I pray that it's been a blessing to you. If this podcast episode has been a blessing, would you consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, whether or not you're here on Spotify or on YouTube? Look forward to more podcasts the year 2026, whatever that looks like. I'm still going to kind of pluck away and continue to do episodes as they come. So thank you so much for tuning in today. If you want to send your questions in, you can send them in to josephporter.anderson@gmail.com. It'll be in the description. Thank you again so much. I pray that you guys have a blessed week, and I will see you in the next one.